Good morning and or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Allan Marks, a partner at Millbank in our Project Energy and Infrastructure group. We've got a terrific panel today to talk about P3s and water, opportunities and challenges. With me today are Brian Cullen, the President and CEO of Vico Infrastructure Company, Chris Elmore from Goldman Sachs, and Alex Shannon from WSP. Hi, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning from Seattle.
Great. Chris, I want to start with you and look first, before we dive deeply into some of these projects and challenges and things that we're seeing in the market, what makes water different than other infrastructure sectors when you're approaching it as an investment opportunity?
Yeah, certainly. I think there are kind of three big items that we've run into that really differentiate water infrastructure. The first one is I define it as an emotional asset class. And so unlike, something goes wrong with the toll road, you're a little bit late to work, not too big of a deal. You give someone's family lead poisoning and there's no recovering from that. And so the level of diligence around it moves from the purely intellectual to the emotional of the end users. And that requires an extra level of care and thought around contract structuring. The second one is the complexity of the below ground distribution system. So you don't know what's underground. It's very hard to price, and that makes transactions more challenging in that just saying I'm going to take over operations of the entire system become very complicated or require nuanced and different procurement and project agreement approaches versus a pure monetization or a pure utility transaction. And the third that we see is the fragmentation within the markets. There are over 30,000 unique water utilities within the US, and many of those are of a size and a scale that it makes it more complicated to execute a transaction for that particular locality. And so those are kind of the three things that I really see differentiate this sector from a lot of the other core infrastructure asset classes.
Yeah, those are certainly true. I know I've said it before when you think about water, you really don't want to think about water. The assumption is you turn on the faucet and there you go. And if what comes out smells bad or looks brown or makes you sick, then suddenly you're thinking about water and not in the best way. Brian, when you look at this disaggregated industry, you look at 30,000 different water utilities or water districts or agencies with whom you could conceivably be doing business and talking to them about risk transfer and talking about all the wonderful benefits you bring in from the private sector under different contracting schemes. How do you decide which of those 30,000 to approach?
Probably the ones that are willing to work with and partner with the private sector, and they're open to creativity, and they're willing to be real partners, I guess, is the key aspect. Less so about trying to find the cheapest solution, lowest cost of capital, lowest cost solution, and really trying to find a partner that is willing to be forward thinking and really appreciate what the private sector has to offer that's unique, that the public sector may not be able to offer. So they're the ones we like to pursue.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about that kind of in specifics, Alex, when a water agency is looking at their own system, quite often they have unfunded maintenance. They have operational efficiencies, which maybe they've gotten into certain habits, but maybe they're not the best thing for the long-term health of the system. Perhaps their rates are too low and they can't afford to make some of the upgrades or modernization that they'd like. How much of this is an engineering problem, and how much of it is either a public policy or capacity problem?
Yeah, you raised some interesting points there, Alan, and this kind of ties what Chris and Brian were talking about together, where utilities, water and wastewater utilities are managed a little bit differently than what we see in transportation. There are different barriers to a P3 coming in. There's different culture at those utilities and how decisions are being made and who's making those decisions. We're looking at a much more local level with city council, public works directors. Those are the team members that are driving these projects, and things aren't put on the ballot measures like they are in transportation. I think that with water in particular, it really is an engineering problem, because you've got a lot of different crazy technical problems that you've got to solve. Treating water, treating wastewater is not necessarily the most straightforward thing to do, especially with all the emerging regulations and contaminants that we have out there. And so, you know, in partnering with the private sector, we really have to have an understanding of those technical challenges first before we bring the financing and the deal structures and the different solutions to solve them.
So if we stay on that technical level, then it strikes me that the risk transfer is going to be different depending on whether we're talking about water supply, water distribution, water treatment, and so forth. Chris, which parts of the water value chain are best suited for P3s, and which ones are maybe not so amenable to that kind of risk transfer?
Yeah, as we typically look at it, I think that the cleanest and kind of easiest place that we see a lot of opportunity for real value creation through a P3 is really around the treatment side. And that exists, we view that kind of for two reasons. One, that's above ground accessible infrastructure. So it's relatively easy to work with it versus, you know, the problem with distribution, you can have the best diligence report in the world. You still don't know exactly what's underground. There are going to be some surprises. And that requires either a lot of contingency, a lot of retained risk, or, you know, kind of rate-based structures which can work well, but can also create misaligned incentives around pushing rates up and driving investment versus what's the minimum prudent investment required. On the treatment side, you don't have that. It's a little bit easier to identify. I think the second piece that we see, particularly around treatment, is it creates the opportunity, one, as Brian was talking about, bringing in the private sector. For many water utilities and districts, they haven't built or done a heavy overhaul of a treatment plant in 10, 30, 40, 50 years. So the expertise on how to manage that project doesn't really exist in-house. And though the expertise on managing your water plant built in 1960 exists, the expertise on how to build the new plant that you're putting in 2023 might require different levels of experience and expertise. And that's a place where partnering with the private sector, who can make optimization decisions between life cycle cost, operating cost, initial delivery, and have performance requirements that are tied through at-risk capital, can start creating, as Brian was saying, it might not be the lowest financing cost, but might be the lowest risk-adjusted all-in delivery approach for that system. So that's where we see the biggest place. Obviously, you know, there are lots of other models out there, but that tends to be the kind of easiest set of transactions where we also see the most upside for value creation.
Okay, and I'll come back to technology in a minute because I like that you touched on that, but I want to stay first with this question of the commercial aspect of it. And I know, Brian, you and I have worked together on P3s for water treatment facilities in particular. And in that project, there was a lot of creativity brought to the table. How much room is there for creativity, or how much need is there for creativity and kind of entrepreneurship in this area?
I think that there's a lot of need for it in terms of being entrepreneurial from the private sector to work with the public sector to bring creativity and bring innovative ideas to the public agency. I think Chris's point is really valid, that a plant that was done 50 years ago may not be the same plant and the same outcome that the public agency is looking for today. A project that we recently pursued and sadly did not prevail on was a project that started out actually not being a treatment plant at all. Actually started out being a real estate development project. It just happened to need a treatment plant in order to enable and unlock the real estate opportunity and create the value that was going to be generated, really more so from the unlocking of the land and really bringing this development to life, basically. And the only way you could do it was by bringing innovative solutions and creative solutions and creative technology and a creative approach to delivering the wastewater side of the project in order to enable the value. And I think that's how we're looking at projects now, is what is it that is the greater value of the project brings to the community to the environment, and really sort of think about it. Not to use maybe an overused term right now, ESG, but how does the ESG piece fit within the public sector that's broader and it goes beyond just the physical asset itself? So, I think as we look at the projects that are out there, it's not just the box or the plant itself, but what does it really mean to the outcome, to the community and to the city? And that's where I think the opportunity really lies. And that, coupled with emerging technologies and the digital transformation of this infrastructure, and really improve the transparency of the performance of these assets. So that's kind of where we see the opportunity going forward.
So Brian, I want to stay with you for a second. So the project you're referring to, which is in Oregon, so we're familiar with it. Did the public agency, did the public or the municipal side embrace that idea of a kind of a holistic view of the project, looking at the social and the real estate impacts, not just the infra water services part of it, or were they more cautious?
Well, initially, very much so. This particular project started out 4 years ago, 2017, and it was originated actually by our team at the time, in partnership with a real estate developer, to try and find this industrial piece of this city that the market had spoken, right? Nobody wanted to develop this land beside an old wastewater plant that was built in 1964, right? That was blocking and obstructing the access to this really nice riverfront property. So it started out as being kind of this land development side, and the city was fully embracing with that idea. And I think that's where you really have the power of the private sector being creative to partner with the public agency to say, how do we solve this problem? How do we create greater value? You're looking at the economics of that particular project back then. Just the property taxes that we generated by the development would pay for the O&M of the new plant. So it's kind of, that's how we sort of think about it. How do you get creative there, and how do you unlock this value? But what transpired was a process and a procurement process that actually took the project to be a process, a procurement, and the real estate was removed from the process, and it was purely a procurement for a treatment plant. And to a certain extent, and maybe this is sour grapes, but to a certain extent, it felt like the soul was out of the project, right? The why behind the project was kind of gone. Probably it still achieved the same objectives, maybe in the long run, but that's where I think the opportunity is. And what we'd like to see, hopefully, in this sector is groups like ours and others in the marketplace, when they're entrepreneurial, creative, and they present an idea to a public agency, let's figure out how to partner on that project to deliver the outcome that you're really trying to deliver. And so the question is, how many more creative ideas are going to come out of the private sector to be used and then put out through a procurement process? That's the part that's somewhat discouraging.
Right. I can see that. I can see too, Alex, if you look at how prescriptive a procurement might be, some of that is what's being procured. Is it just a facility that's being procured, or is it a service that's being procured, or is it a solution to a maybe broader, more creatively defined problem, as Brian points out? But just looking at the technological side of this, how prescriptive should procurement bid or bids be in order to make sure that the bids that come in really can be compared apples to apples, versus maybe being focused on outcomes but agnostic as the technological solution to get there, in order to inspire innovation and better value for money?
Yeah, and I apologize for the little visitor in the background there.
No, actually, I like your dog very much.
In when he wants. That's where the opportunities for these P3s really lie, because if we have a less prescriptive procurement process that provides an opportunity for innovation, that's where you're really starting to get value out of this. And private entities that are bringing new approaches to operations, new technologies for treatment, that's where a community can think about a holistic solution to a problem. So structuring your procurement around those outcomes is where these P3s have the opportunity to be successful. And the reality of it, Allan, as we've talked about, is the cost of financing projects right now going through public financing is quite low. WIFIA is offering very advantageous firms. They're injecting a lot of funds through the American Jobs plan that Biden's got, the discretionary budget that they're putting forward to Congress. All this is injecting some of that money. But what it's not doing is injecting the creativity and the ways in which to tackle a problem more holistically. And that's where the private sector can really add a lot of value.
If I could actually jump in super quickly, and I think one distinction I would make, which I've seen around kind of successful processes, is that the procurement itself should be very prescriptive, but the outcomes should be very performance-based.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective.
And the reason I make that distinction is we've seen some procurements that are kind of like, I need a new water treatment facility. How are you going to pay for it? Is it availability payment? Is it revenue risk? What are the risk parameters? Is there ancillary development? Oh, go figure it out and give us your best proposal. You're not going to get good proposals under that, because the procurement itself is way too open-ended. And so I think it's finding a way to say, we've identified this is the specific need, and here's the general framework, but I want the best technology, the best ideas, the most efficient outcome. You get to figure out the interplay between life cycle, between O&M, between technology, between and I'm going to briefly get way out over my skis, like what chemical processes you're using. Like, as long as we get clean water out the back end that meets, what type of water we're putting in the front end, have at it for 30 years. That's where you really get a lot of that innovation. But you also need to clearly define the rules for the private sector to know how to engage with you to get to that outcome if you decide to go down a procured path. So you actually also then have certainty that you're really getting best value, versus comparing, very, very different plans that have completely different risk profiles and payment profiles that may be challenging to evaluate.
Right. So, for example, I might tell you, look, I need to get from point A to point B. I'd like to be able to do it. I want to do my quarter mile in under 12 seconds. I'd like to not burn any gasoline or not have any emissions, or do it, in some other clean way. But it's up to you whether that's going to be a Tesla or an expensive Porsche EV, or it's going to be something which is a whole lot cheaper and maybe doesn't have a great radio, but can meet all those metrics as well. Kind of depending what your goals are. But you, as the public agency, you kind of got to figure out how you're going to pay for it. Is it, and how many risks of this you're willing to take. And if there's room for commercial creativity, like that's another type of innovation. I guess, Brian, the question is, how does the commercial creativity come into this? How much optionality or financing flexibility? It's not cost of capital. It's actually, it's a little more nuanced than that. How much commercial creativity can there be? And how should that get worked into that bid process?
I think there's a lot of room for commercial creativity, and I think there needs to be an incentive in there to enable that. When you get too prescriptive, push back on the prescriptive side of the procurement. When you get too prescriptive, and you create a kind of a cost plus not to exceed environment where you have to say, this is my cost of capital, this is my markup. Maybe that's not what you're saying, but I think the challenge with that is it doesn't create the room for that creativity and that upside, right? There's only a downside actually in that type of environment. So I think from a commercial standpoint, I think we've got a lot of opportunity to be creative. And I think as infrastructure developers in the infrastructure development community, I think we have a lot to learn from the real estate development community, because I think in the US we do a great job in real estate development. I think we do not a good job on the infrastructure development. It becomes, you'd never see a municipality getting over prescriptive on a real estate development. They would say, here's our outcomes, here's our entitlement process, here's our rules and permit regulations and so on, comply with them. But as it relates to infrastructure development, and particularly as it relates to water, we get into the details of, types of membranes you're going to use, and types of chemicals, and types of disinfection, and so on and so forth. It becomes incredibly prescriptive. And I think what Chris was saying, which I agree with, is how do you structure these procurements to be more outcome driven? How does it deliver the outcome that the public agency and the ratepayers are really looking for, and give the incentive to the private sector to take that risk, because the private sector is perfectly willing to invest a lot of capital into creativity and take that risk. But if you're going to prescribe it too much, you're going to get pushback from the private sector, and they're going to say, not really interested.
Yeah, so let's look at risk transfer a little more carefully. And I know other panels will be talking about different aspects of this. I don't want to overlap with them. But Alex, if you think about risk transfer, the first thing you have to think of is risk identification. And the second, and I think procurement processes usually do a pretty good job of bringing that out. The second part of it is risk value, right? The pricing for that risk. And a lot of the risks that the public sector is already bearing, that a public water agency already has, may not be fully transparent, especially during the operating period. How do you get people to get on the same page, public and private, in building that partnership and aligned around the value of the risks that are being transferred?
Yeah, this is where you make or break the P3 deal, I think, is in how you prepare and present that value for money analysis and capture those risks. And there's a lot of great standards and data out there as far as how to actually monetize risk. And there's some pretty big ones. If you look at infrastructure that's in a state of disrepair, the risk associated with simply just operating a treatment plant in those conditions is fairly apparent. But it's harder to capture the broader risk associated with the operational goals and the levels of service goals that a utility would have. And I'm thinking like water quality and effluent discharge into an impaired water body, or like nutrient removal in Puget Sound in my backyard here. How do you monetize that? That's really tricky. And I don't know that we have necessarily a great answer for that yet, but there's opportunity there to really think about the risk that a public agency and thereby the public are bearing with these facilities right now, and how we value that and how we present that and really capture everything is so important to presenting the benefits of doing a P3. And I also wanted to touch real quick, Allan, on, we talked a lot about treatment systems, but I think there's a huge opportunity for creative innovation. And if somebody figures this out, they could be very successful with private investment in the linear systems, because so much of what happens at the treatment plant and the risk and the issues there start in the linear system. And because the vertical infrastructure is large, it's visible, it's sexy, it's what ultimately is treating this water and putting it out there, it gets a lot of attention. But we're seeing a ton of need in the linear system that hasn't been addressed in the same way. And this is where private sector may be able to partner with technology companies out there that are doing digital water work to better manage that linear system. I don't know what that looks like. Like I said, if somebody figures that out, good for you. Kudos there. But a couple of thoughts to think about.
Well, let's stay with digital water, because I love that phrase, and it seems to mean different things to some different people. I'm dealing with, I dealt with a water pipeline project where, one of the questions is, do you put in sensors so that you can, have leak detection, right? And then alert something shut down valve, so you don't have to have a person wait to go out and find mud before you've got a problem. And if it's buried, that's especially important. I know there's, a lot of energy savings, because energy is a big component of water, where Huge. Digital can be of great help. From the technical side, Alex, what do you mean by digital water?
Traditionally, I think that's been thought of as AMI, automated meter infrastructure, where we're, not having meter readers go out, or they're going out in different capacities to collect that information. And it gives us better leak detection, better just, instant updates as to water usage. So that can be transferred to operations and how you operate the treatment plant and how you operate the linear system to manage that demand, get better forecasts. I think it's all about limiting the non-revenue water that goes out the door, conserving, and then of course, making sure that your costs are in check relative to what you're able to collect from your customers. There's also just a lot of data management as it relates to risk and resiliency, monitoring flows and sewer systems. That's relatively new. We have flow monitors out there, but it's not like AMI on the drinking water side, where we know how much water you use throughout the day. We don't know how much sewer is used. We assume it's the same as the water coming in as the water going out. But, and looking at water resources, stormwater, and the I&I managing infiltration of that stormwater into sanitary or combined sanitary sewer system. Those are huge costs, especially up here where you've got a lot of rain in the Northwest. That's managing those costs would be a big win if we're able to whittle those down.
So, Brian, if you look at some of the resilience issues that come up, and we see with climate change, extreme weather events, more intense storms which trigger greater runoff, a lot of that impacts this too. How are the costs of hardening water infrastructure being handled, and are they part of this P3 solution too?
Sorry, hardening?
Yeah, for example, making the water systems more resilient. And I'll give you a specific example. Let's say you've got a water treatment plant, and the water that's coming through an urban system may be affected by other things that are going on. You could have stormwater contamination. You could have brine issues from water softeners. There are a lot of different things that could be happening that you have to plan for, but they could be different, right? 10 or 20 years from now than the system is today. How do you build in that resilience against water quality change, technical change, and weather events and external changes?
I mean, I would probably bet on the technology piece, on the digital aspect of that as being a big solution to predict, those types of impacts. I think Alex's point is right on in terms of being more sort of within the network itself, and having telemetry and sensors out there within the network to predict some of these emerging issues that might be happening. One project that you and I are involved with, Allan, on you mentioned water softeners, and it kind of got me smiling a little bit because of the discharge that's going down into the sanitary system. Well, how do you deal with that downstream, or do you deal with that upstream? And how do you be smart about that, and how do you integrate technology to predict those kind of things? And clearly you want to solve the problem upstream rather than downstream from a cost standpoint, and so on. But leveraging technologies, I think, up in the system to predict some of these future issues is a great opportunity. And this one project that we were looking at in bidding in Oregon was kind of interesting, because the average flow of this treatment plant is about 6.5 million gallons a day on a dry day, during the dry season. But in the wet season, on a peak day, you might get up to 40 million gallons a day or even higher. So it's actually, it's really significant on the wet weather impacts. So how do you think be creative to solve the problem upstream by leveraging technology, telemetry systems, and applying digital technologies upstream, utilize the existing collection system for maybe capacity related matters, and not have to deal with it downstream? And I think there's a great opportunity in the lateral systems to be able to develop technology into that side of the business, and privately fund it. Take that risk.
Right, Chris. When you look at the possibility of water recycling, because this is another area where in areas, if fresh water becomes scarce, and the cost of pumping or transporting water from distant places becomes too expensive or not worth it, maybe desalination is an option, maybe that's too expensive. You've got all this wonderful water you just cleaned up. And unlike the bottle at the grocery store, we actually know what's in it in most places. It's been tested. It's probably pretty safe. And there's a lot of laws that say, but you can't drink it, or at least you can't sell it to people to drink. You can use it to recharge your aquifer. You can do other things with it. Are we going to see more purple pipe kind of expansion? Are we going to see true recycling of water coming up? And are those areas where the private sector could kind of lend a nice push?
Great question. If I knew that answer, I'd be in a different career for predicting the future. But I think the short answer is yes. I think particularly in the American West, right? And so, it's always funny when you're doing a financing transaction for an East Coast water utility, and people are asking questions about, what's your source supply and how many times does it run low? And, directors of water utilities out here are like, I don't, like, what do you mean? Where in the West, that's like very high on your list of things to worry about. So I think there's going to be a wide array of both technology and different solutions and different regulatory frameworks that will be required to manage scarcity that is increasing, and at least so far seems to be correlated with climate change, that parts of the American West are getting structurally more, kind of source deficient. And so whether that's going to be, recharge, whether that's going to be direct reuse, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more focus around conservation, because there aren't going to be other options. And, there are places where, it's like, okay, do we spend $20+ billion to get more water from Northern California to Southern California? Okay, maybe we can do that once. But then you've got, okay, how do we get more money to, Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico? And there are a lot of places where it's going to keep, Nevada, where you're going to have to come up with new solutions. And I think that is also a place where utilizing the private sector to take risk on the performance of those new solutions, I think can be a place where existing utilities say, well, I've never done this before. I don't know if it's going to work. Let's get someone who has done this elsewhere in the world to partner with us for figuring out, delivering, and maintaining those new solutions.
Right, and you're right about this. Some of it is climate change, where we have more extreme heat, more droughts, or at least droughts that are where you get less of a gap between them. We're seeing that in California, for example. Now, some of it is the hydrology. Our assumptions about the Colorado River Basin just turned out to be wrong, because they were based on an unusually wet century at the time we looked at it. I want to invite people, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. We've had a couple come in already, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I wanted to, Brian, before we do that, just ask you quickly too about the if we switch to the political side of this, and some of the questions that have come in relate to this, there is a question of how receptive are public agencies to this creativity and entrepreneurship. I mean, if do they really have the incentives to experiment this way, when the downside risk of a project which is not built or doesn't work or costs too much, or the private sector makes too much money, if it seems like it's an unreasonable thing? There's a lot of things that you might be reasonably worried about if you're on the public side. How should we increase the capacity of those local governments to partner with a company like yours?
Well, I don't want to answer your question with being a downer, but I have to say that we're not that optimistic about the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit coming from the private sector being accepted by the public sector. I think the ideas and the creativity is accepted and it's embraced, but I don't think it fits well with the process of awarding a project. And not to keep repeating the subject on this project that we did not prevail on, but I mean, this was a project that was developed 4 years ago, and it's a very creative concept. It was a project that was originated actually by my former company, Perk Water, but it was it was originated and created by this idea to redevelop the land, and it was fully embraced. Had the proposal been accepted at the time, the plant would finish construction this summer, and it would probably be about $20 million lower than what it's going to cost. Okay, so now you have to go through, I guess there's a political need and requirement, and maybe somewhat statutory, to go through the procurement process, but sometimes process can overcome and kill the ingenuity and the creativity. So the question is, groups like ours in the private sector and others out there in the community of infrastructure development, are we willing to spend our time to be creative and offer these creative ideas to the public sector to be potentially competing for that very idea that you came up with. And I think there's a lot of business out there for us to spend our time on, and we're willing to spend capital and dollars on and invest in these projects. But we're not interested, and I think I'm not alone with this, that we're not interested in investing in projects and investing in development of projects only to be educating the competition, right? We don't mind competing, but there's no point in educating the competition, right? I mean, why do that? Rather do something else with the capital and the time. So that's the unfortunate part that I think is a real challenge between the private sector and the public sector. I mean, everybody knows that there's plenty of capital out there, and everybody knows there's plenty of demand out there. The question is, why is there not a lot more of marrying up between the private capital and the public sector? And I think a lot of it comes down to just the process, the fragmentation of the sector, and maybe a lot of distrust that exists between the public sector and the private sector. And I don't mean that as to be a downer or a negative, because I'm very optimistic about other secondary parts of the market. But I think from a primary side of private capital going into the public sector is a real challenge. And I know we're tight for time here, but one final point is, we did a survey a few weeks ago, a poll on LinkedIn, which I'd like to just present here a little bit. It was, yes, we had the question, and we said, given the Biden infrastructure plan, how many privately funded P3s do you think will be awarded over the next 5 years? So we wanted to find out. And we had 2,700 views of the poll. We only had
how many responses?
66. So that's kind of revealing. 66 out of 2,700, which is kind of revealing by itself, right?
It is.
But what was interesting was here are the results. We had 29% think there's going to be 0, 33% think there's going to be 1 to 5, 21% 6 to 10, and 17% greater than 10, just for US water on new infrastructure. So the question is, do we know our market? And do we really know the market? And from a private sector standpoint and being entrepreneurial, where do we want to go to the public sector that embraces the creativity and willing to truly partner with the private sector? And that's where we see the opportunities going forward. And we don't really want to just spend a bunch of time kind of educating and then just competing for that very idea. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting. I want to come back to something you mentioned, because you mentioned the Biden infrastructure plan, and of course, there's lots of ink being spilled about what's going to eventually be implemented and how will it pass Congress and all the rest of that. We had a question that came in from someone asking about federal policy criteria, federal incentives that could be done. I know, Brian, you mentioned the WIFIA program before. The infrastructure plan that's on the table, at least from the White House right now, and which has support in the House, and we'll see where it goes in the Senate, does include significant federal resources for water treatment, for water supply, for dealing with saltwater coastal intrusion into aquifers from climate change and rising sea levels, storm and flood control. I mean, there's a lot in there that's really water focused, arguably even more than there is for energy on a standalone basis. So that's fine. Is there room, do you think, and do you think the administration would be has people moving in the direction of embracing some kind of a standardized P3 model that localities or local agencies could use, or otherwise, helping to create that so that you're not reinventing the wheel every single time, much like we've seen, more on the transportation side, through TIFIA and federal highways. Certainly, maybe not to the degree like we've seen in Canada on infrastructure, where it's very top down. But are there ways that the federal government could be stretching those dollars and attracting private co-financing and risk transfer that would basically accelerate these programs and make them better? Chris?
Yeah, I think I'd maybe disaggregate that into two pieces. So, and you hear a lot of the rhetoric coming out that part of the view of this is not just, I'm going to send out a lot of grant dollars, but I'm going to send out competitive grant dollars that are trying to identify local match. And then I think the question is the form of the local match, your local utility just selling muni bonds, or is it through a P3? And I think that's the question for, at the federal level, how much do they want to provide incentives around that, which I think they can definitely do, particularly around eligibility criteria. And I think it's less so than saying do a P3, but back to Alex's earlier point, being more thoughtful about risk allocation and having the private sector own the risks that they're good at owning and the public sector own the risks that they're good at owning, that can be, helpful in encouraging, transaction types. I fear, for various reasons, that even having a federal center of excellence around P3 procurement for water, for transportation, et cetera, will have absolutely no impact on the quality or number of P3s that are delivered at the state and local level. There is, I think, a combination of the fragmentation and from a political science perspective, the deep libertarian nature of how U.S. government entities interact with each other that makes it very challenging for a federal overlay to be materially advantageous at the local level. What that also creates is, I think, there's the special snowflake syndrome, where every single water utility client is a special snowflake, or at least they believe that's the case. That is true. I think there is more similarity between many of them than they want to admit. But the needs are so different that saying, well, here's a standard form for, a treatment facility versus, linear infrastructure versus them combined versus availability payment versus revenue risk. Very quickly, you've got a lot of contracts. And now you've got to layer in, oh, well, does your state have the water authority that's procuring it, are there powers given to them from the state? Do they have home rule? Are they a city-created agency? Are they self-elected authority? How does appropriation risk work? And suddenly your form contract has so many square brackets in it, it's hard to be valuable. So, I think having a center of excellence for best practices around like risk transfer and risk allocation and making that part of the, project evaluation criteria, I think makes a lot of sense. We've seen a lot of federal efforts to try and create centers of excellence around P3 procurement and has had absolutely no impact on the quality or number of P3s being procured.
So, Alex, if you look then at what another thing that the federal government could do, I like this idea of a center of excellence of kind of, best practices, being shared. Today's Earth Day, right?
It is.
And a lot of what's going on in the water sector is just waste. It's hugely energy intensive, as we mentioned before. It's not the most efficient way to get water, transported, used especially, and cleaned, and then maybe reused. Is it possible that federal funding could be tied to objective metrics that relate to the efficacy and climate friendliness of the water system, and use that as a way to basically incentivize districts, if they want to tap into those monies, to partner with private solution providers that could come up with innovative solutions that deal with some of those environmental constraints?
Yes and no. I think underlying all of this are the affordability considerations of water and wastewater infrastructure. And because people pay their monthly bills, as opposed to, on a tax roll or however you pay your water rates, there is a rate. You're paying for use. And so it creates this culture of wanting to understand where that money is going towards. It feels different than when you're paying for transportation projects. And I think there's also this perception out there that because water is like the most basic ingredient for life, that it should not cost that much. We're not really good as an industry about helping people understand what goes into it. And that comes from a history of the federal government providing grants to build a lot of this stuff back in the 70s. And I go back to the linear system as well. There's all this infrastructure out there that is extraordinarily expensive to replace because it's buried in the ground, that incentivizing for certain outcomes may have an effect where we actually further create this gap between the systems that are operating very well, that are delivering clean water, and those that are struggling because they are unable to collect the money that they need to meet those metrics and requirements. And unfortunately, that happens in areas that are historically underserved, where we have people across different economic classes, and unfortunately, in our country, areas that are predominantly BIPOC. So we really have to be careful when considering performance, that we're thinking about these affordability considerations as well.
Yeah, affordability is a big deal. Affordability is kind of odd too in the water context because let's compare it to energy. I mean, generally speaking, what you pay for a kilowatt hour of electricity, if you're plugged in the same location, doesn't matter what you're using the power for, you're going to pay pretty much the same price. And if it's portable, if it's in a battery, you're going to pay more. But I mean, so there are variabilities.
I realize I didn't talk about electricity at all in that answer, but I think your point is, we could be more efficient for sure. And if we can find ways to bring efficiencies to the system, into how water gets moved and treated, and actually demonstrate that, the innovation that the private sector brings lowers the cost. And again, it's this thing that Brian talked about the other day, cost of capital versus capital cost. You pull on one of those strings and things actually could be really advantageous for the community. But we're going up against this kind of also distrust and these cultural ideas about water that we've got to address.
Well, and that's where the federal government coming in with trillions of dollars, which may filter down, if you pardon the pun, as someone had in the chat, and could have some strings attached to it. You do get to support it. It has as a nexus with those social goals we talked about at the beginning, and with affordability, because the systems that are the most in need of curing deferred maintenance are probably in a lot of the places, whether urban or rural, that has the least ability to pay for rate increases.
And thereby, when you come in with private financing, that does have a higher cost of capital compared to those 1% to 2% interest rates we've seen recently on green infrastructure bonds and WIFIA financing. That's a tough pill to swallow. And if you do it in the wrong way, it can be too aggressive and too much for the public agency to really tolerate, because they have access to that other funding.
Yeah. Well, let me give the last word to you, Brian, because we're running out of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, I think the burden is on us in the private sector to really demonstrate why we should be compensated for what we're compensated for, and we should be able to deliver. We should be in a position to deliver the creativity and the ideas, whether it's land redevelopment or whether it's a better ESG footprint for the public sector. I mean, when's that going to start to make its way into the elected officials, that they start thinking about things that are broader than just maybe the rates? What kind of impact are they making on the environment and so on, that they might be willing to pay a premium for things like that, right? So I mean, I'd love to see this market get away from this debate of cost of capital and really move towards delivering better outcomes, for the community, for the environment, better governance, better transparency. That would be great to see. And we're optimistic about that. We're very optimistic that the private capital will probably have some continued headwinds on the competing against SRF and WIFIA and all the things that are in the public side. But I think there's great opportunity in the secondary market to invest in everything that needs to be done in order for this infrastructure bill to get spent, basically. And that's where we see some great opportunities. But we have to think differently. We have to really focus on value to the community, digital transformation, alternative energy solutions, better governance, better transparency, and better outcomes to the environment. And I think the private sector is willing to do that, perfectly willing to do that. And I think that the market is there for it. It's just, how do we make sure that the process enables that to happen? And we're very optimistic about it.
Good, thank you. If I've got you optimistic, we have to stop, because that's the nice place to get you. So, Brian, Chris, Alex, terrific conversation. Thank you very much for sharing. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.